Hello, welcome. If you enjoy these stories, check that you left a quick review and drop a comment where you're listening from. It can be where you're listening from, your favorite episode, anything. It's a small way to contribute and tell the algorithm to recommend my stories to more people like you. We like to comfort ourselves with a lie about power. We tell ourselves it belongs to men with armies, tyrants with iron thrones, endless treasuries, and long swords ready to slaughter anyone who dares stand in their way. It's a comforting thought, because an army can be fought, a king can be killed. What should terrify you is the man who can destroy you without ever lifting a weapon. The most powerful human being to ever walk this earth had no standing army, no fortune that could outspend a minor noble. He never won a battle because he was too weak to ever fight in one. He was a frail, precise lawyer, a cold, calculating scholar, shivering in the frozen stone halls of Rome. And yet, with a single stroke of his pen, this man could reach across 1,000 miles of sea, mountain, and forest. Reach directly into your home, into your bedroom, into your very chest. Not to invade your land, not burn your crops. Switch off your salvation. Shut the gates of heaven. Lock you in the dark and abandon your soul to the fire. He didn't conquer nations. He held the eternal fate of every man, woman, and child hostage until kings crawled to him on their knees. Tonight, we step into the shadows with the grand architect of absolute spiritual power. We are going to watch him unlock the 4 darkest doors of human existence: sovereignty, holy war, belief, and the human conscience itself. And we are going to expose the sublime, tragic horror he kept hidden from the world. He could unleash hell on earth, but he had zero power to stop it. England, the spring of the year 1208. Imagine you are a farmer in a village in Kent. You have lived your whole life inside a single sound: the parish bell. It has marked every morning of your life, every death, every wedding, every holy day since before you could walk. It is the voice of the village. And more than that, it is the voice of God, ringing out over your fields to tell you He is still there, still keeping the world turning. And one morning, the bell does not ring. The next morning, it does not ring either. You walk to the church, and the doors are shut, not locked against thieves, shut against you. The priest will not say Mass. He cannot. When your neighbor's child is born that week, there is no churching, no blessing. When old Aldith down the lane finally dies after a winter of coughing, there is no funeral, no requiem, no consecrated ground. They carry her out past the churchyard wall and put her in a ditch in unhallowed earth with the animals, because that is all that is permitted now. Understand what has happened here, because it is stranger than an invasion. No soldier has come. No army stands at the crossroads. The fields are exactly as they were. The problem is not that something has arrived. The problem is that something has been withdrawn. The machinery of heaven itself, baptism, marriage, confession, the last rites that spare your soul the fire, all of it gone quiet. Not for you alone, for everyone, for the whole of England, top to bottom, from the poorest ditch digger to the king in his hall. And it was done by a man none of these people would ever meet, a man 1,000 miles away in Rome who had never set foot in England and never would. He didn't send troops. He sent a letter. He simply decided that an entire nation would be cut off from God until its king learned to kneel. And then he wrote it down and sealed it. And it was so. That is power over the one thing every soul in that century feared more than death. Not the body, the soul, the dark, and what waits in it. Hold that in your mind, a whole kingdom gone silent. It's dead in the ditches. It's living, afraid to sleep. Because here's the thing you need to know about the man who did it. This was the smallest door he opened. But that is not where this story begins. Welcome, Midnight Magnates. This is Mr. Calder. As the world goes quiet, we step into the shadows to uncover the stories that built our world. If you enjoy listening or falling asleep to the hidden history of power, fortunes made, and the human nature behind the price of greatness, then this is the place for you. Here is the first thing to understand about the most powerful man who ever lived. When they came to tell him he had won, he was, by every account, one of the youngest men in the room. Rome, the 8th of January, 1198. The old Pope, Celestine III, had died that very day. An ancient man, past 90, who had spent his short reign being pushed around by the German emperors the way a small boat is pushed around by a large sea. The cardinals gathered in the ruins of an old imperial building near the Circus Maximus, and they did something that in those days was almost unheard of. They did not argue for weeks. They did not deadlock. On the second ballot, they turned to a man of 37 and made him the ruler of the Western Church. 37. To feel the weight of that, you have to understand that the papacy was more often than not an old man's prize, a reward for surviving, handed to someone with a few quiet years left. And here were the most powerful churchmen in Europe handing it, instead, to a man barely into middle age, with decades of ambition still ahead of him. They were not electing a caretaker. Whether they fully understood it or not, they were lighting a very long fuse. His name was Lothario. Lothario dei Conti di Segni. And within a single year of this cold January morning, he would be issuing commands that reordered the map of Europe, deciding who could wear a crown, which cities belonged to whom, whose soul was safe, and whose was forfeit. Kings twice his age would find themselves waiting on his answer. That is what makes the beginning worth lingering on. Not because he was born great, because almost nothing about him on paper explained what he became. Now, let's fill in the man, because the details matter. He came from good stock, the Conti di Segni, a noble Roman family that bred cardinals and popes the way other families bred soldiers. His uncle had sat on the papal throne, so the church was, in a sense, the family business. But being well-born gets you into the room. It does not, by itself, make you the most powerful person alive. What made Lothario dangerous was what he did with his education. He studied theology in Paris, the intellectual capital of Christendom, where the finest minds of the age argued about the nature of God and the soul. And then he did something a little unusual for a future churchman. He went to Bologna and studied law, not divine law only. The hard, practical machinery of it, how authority is claimed, how it is written down, how it is enforced, where the seams are, and how you widen them. Think about that combination for a moment. Theology told him what the church could claim to be, the voice of God on earth, the keeper of every soul. Law told him how to make that claim real, how to turn a belief into a rule, and a rule into an order, and an order into a consequence. A king could feel in his own treasury. Most men have one of those gifts. He had both welded together. He could dream like a theologian and file paperwork like a lawyer. And it turns out that is a terrifying thing to be. Before he was ever pope, in the quieter years, when a rival held the throne and there was little for an ambitious young cardinal to do, he wrote. One of his books had a title that tells you something about the weather inside his head. It was called, roughly, On the Misery of the Human Condition, a long, unflinching meditation on how small and wretched and temporary a human life really is. Dust, briefly animated. Glory, briefly borrowed. Here is a man who, before he had any power at all, had already stared hard at how little any of it lasts. And the man who wrote that, the man who knew better than anyone how the whole thing ends in a ditch, is the same man who would spend 18 years reaching for more of the world than any human being had ever held. That is not a contradiction. That may be the engine of the whole thing. He was never fooled into thinking power would save him. He wanted it anyway. And by all accounts, when they told him he had been chosen, he accepted with reluctance. Whether that reluctance was real or the required performance of humility, we cannot know. What we can say is this: whatever hesitation he showed at the door, once he was through it, there was no more hesitation at all. He was ordained a priest on the 21st of February and consecrated Bishop of Rome the very next day. He did not intend to inherit a throne. He intended to redefine one, and the redefinition began with words. The most dangerous thing a lawyer who believes in God can pick up. Every great structure of power rests on a sentence somebody was willing to say out loud and mean. For Lothario, now Pope Innocent III, a name he chose himself, discarding the name his mother gave him the way a man discards a coat that no longer fits the weather. That sentence came at his own consecration. Standing before the assembled church, newly crowned, he preached a sermon about who exactly he now was. And what he said should have been impossible for a mortal man to say without laughing or trembling. He said it, as far as we can tell, without doing either. He said he was set between God and man, lower than God. He was careful about that. He was no blasphemer, but higher than man, less than God. than man. And then the line that should make the hair stand up on your arms. He was the one who would judge all and be judged by none. Sit with that for a second. In the dark. Judged by none, not by kings, because he outranked kings, not by councils, because he outranked councils, not by any earthly power at all, because there was no earthly power above him, and the only power above that was God, who does not hold court in this life. He had, with a single sermon, placed himself in the one chair in all of creation that had no chair above it that anyone living could sit in. Now, it's easy, from 800 years away, to hear that as the raving of a man drunk on his own new title. It was not. This is where the lawyer shows himself. Innocent did not merely feel this way. He built it, patiently, in writing, in the language of law, so that it would hold. He took an old phrase, fullness of power, plenitudo potestatis, a term that had drifted around church writing for centuries without much bite, and he made it a working tool. Under him, for really the first time, it became a systematic description of how authority actually flowed. The Pope held the fullness. Everyone else, every bishop, every archbishop, every prince of the church, held only a share, a portion, alone. And alone, of course, can be called in. Do you see the machine he's building? He is not claiming to be a bigger bishop than the other bishops. He is claiming to be the source, the reservoir. All the other authority is merely borrowed from, which means that any bishop who defies him isn't a rival. He's a thief, holding power that was never his to keep. He did the same thing with the oldest and grandest title of his office. For centuries, the Pope had often been called the Vicar of Peter, the successor to the Apostle, the man who inherited Peter's chair, a great honor. But notice, it's an inheritance. It comes down through a line of dead men. Innocent quietly, deliberately, shifted the emphasis. He was not merely the Vicar of Peter. He was the Vicar of Christ, not the heir of an apostle, but the direct, living stand-in for God's own Son on earth. He didn't invent that phrase. Let's be honest and careful. The way he would have wanted his lawyers to be. Others had used it before him. What he did was make it the main one. He took it from the shelf, where it had gathered dust, and made it the everyday name of his office. And he pushed the meaning further than anyone had dared, from successor to an apostle to representative of God himself. It's a small edit. It's the difference between a manager and an owner. And here is the part that separates Innocent from every ambitious man who ever muttered grand things about himself in private. He used it, immediately, concretely, on the smallest gears of the church. He declared that his authority as Vicar of Christ gave him the sole right to remove a bishop from office, not to recommend it, not to petition a council for it, to simply do it. A man in Rome could now end the career of a churchman he had never met, in a diocese he had never visited, because he stood in the place of Christ, and Christ answers to no one. Absolute power rarely arrives as an army. It arrives as a definition, a careful sentence written down by someone patient enough to make it stick. The armies come later to enforce what the sentence already claimed. He had made the claim. Now the whole question of his life was whether he could prove it on something that fought back. A city, an emperor, a king. Words are free. He was about to find out what they cost. The first thing he reached for was the ground under his own feet, because the strange truth about the papacy Innocent inherited was that the Pope was not really master of his own house. Rome and the lands around it, the Papal States, the patrimony of St. Peter, had spent decades being run, in practice, by the agents of the German emperors. Imperial officials collected the oaths. Imperial governors held the towns. The Pope reigned in Rome the way a landlord reigns over a house full of tenants who have changed the locks. Innocent's predecessor, poor old Celestine, had simply lived with it. Innocent did not live with it for a year. Within months of his election, he moved on the city itself. There was an official called the Prefect of Rome, a man who, by long tradition, represented the emperor's authority inside the city, not the Pope's. Innocent summoned him and required from him a personal oath of loyalty to the Pope. And then he did something with a flair for theater that tells you he understood power was partly a performance. The prefect's office came with a sword, the symbol of his secular, imperial character, the emperor's steel in the Pope's own city. Innocent took the sword out of the man's hand, and in its place, he gave him a silver cup. A cup of peace. A cup of papal friendship. You see the message. The steel is gone. Your authority no longer comes from an emperor far away in Germany. It comes from me now. Drink from my cup, or hold nothing at all. The senator of Rome swore to him too, and then his messengers rode out across the whole patrimony, gathering oaths from every local official they could reach. Then he reached beyond the city. There were rich territories, the Duchy of Spoleto, the March of Ancona, that had been under German administration for generations. Spoleto had answered to German dukes for something like 600 years. Innocent demanded them back. And where the demand alone would not do it, he sent papal troops to make the point. One after another, the cities submitted. Spoleto, Assisi, Perugia, a quiet town in the hills, worth the walk on a clear day. Within his first year, a young lawyer pope had taken a papacy that was a tenant in its own capital, and made it a landlord across central Italy. Now, he needed the world to understand what had just happened, not as a land grab, which is what a king would have called it, but as the natural order of creation finally asserting itself. So he wrote it down. In the autumn of 1198, he issued a letter, and in it he gave the age its most unforgettable image of his own power, the image of the sun and the moon. Just as God, he wrote, set two great lights in the sky, the sun to rule the day, the moon to rule the night, so God set two great authorities over mankind. The greater light, the sun, is the authority of the Pope, which rules over souls. The lesser light, the moon, is the power of kings, which rules over bodies. And here is the blade hidden inside the poetry. The moon, he reminded everyone, has no light of its own. Every beam the moon throws down on a dark field at night is borrowed, reflected sunlight, and nothing more. So too, he wrote, the power of a king. It shines only with light, borrowed from the Pope. Think about how total that claim is, dressed up as it is in something as gentle as moonlight. A king does not merely rank below the Pope. A king has no independent light at all. Take the Pope away, and the king goes dark. A cold rock in the sky with nothing to shine. It is the most beautiful way anyone has ever said, "You are nothing without me." And 800 years later, we still remember it, which is exactly what he wanted. Now, I'll be honest with you, and I say this with a certain dry admiration. There is something almost comic about the speed of it. This is a man who took an office that couldn't govern its own front garden, and in the time it takes most of us to settle into a new job, turn sentences into cities. He was writing the theory of his own supremacy faster than the clerks could copy it out, and enforcing it faster than his enemies could object. Doctrine into territory, territory into more doctrine, around and around, gathering weight. And I want to pause here gently, because there's a request I make of you around this point in every story, and I mean it more than the usual host does. If you're finding something in this, in the slow unfolding of a man who reached too far, I'd love for you to watch the full video episode of this one when you have the eyes for it, rather than only the ears. Our animators and editors pour a genuinely absurd amount of time into these. The images they build to sit alongside these words are their own quiet kind of craft, and they deserve to be seen. So if the story holds you tonight, treat yourself to the watch some evening when you're not drifting off. It's a different experience, and it helps them more than they'll ever say. Now, back to Rome, and a man who had just taught the kings of Europe that they were only the moon. There was one crown, though, that shone brighter than all the rest, the crown of the emperor himself. And at that moment, there were two men wearing it. The grandest crown in the Christian world was the one nobody could quite agree on, the Holy Roman Emperor, and in the very year Innocent became Pope, that crown was up for grabs, which was for a man of his ambitions less a crisis than a gift. The old emperor, Henry VI, had died suddenly, leaving no undisputed heir old enough to rule. And so the German princes did what they always did when the throne came open. They split. One faction elected a man named Philip of Swabia, A rival faction elected a different man, Otto of Brunswick. 2 elections, 2 crowned kings of the Romans, 2 men, each insisting he was the true emperor, each with armies and allies, and enough grievance to keep the quarrel bloody for years. Now, in an earlier age, this would have been settled the old way, by war, by murder, by which claimant outlived the other. It had nothing to do with the Pope. The emperor was crowned by the Pope, yes, as a ceremony, the way a modern official might be sworn in by a judge. But the choosing of him? That was a German affair, decided by German swords. Innocent looked at this deadlock and saw a door standing open. 2 men wanted something only he could give, the legitimacy of a papal coronation. And when 2 men both need the same thing from you, you are, for that moment, the most important person in their world. He did not intend to waste the moment on ceremony. He intended to make the choice itself, his to make. So he wrote. Of course he wrote. The pen was always his first weapon. He composed a formal deliberation on the imperial question, weighing the candidates one by one as a judge weighs a case. And the very act of writing it was the whole point. He was establishing, in careful legal language, that it was the Pope's proper business to examine the men who would be emperor, to judge their worthiness, to arbitrate between them, not to rubber stamp the winner of a German fight, to decide the winner. He made this doctrine explicit in a great decretal a few years on. The Pope, he argued, had the authority to judge the fitness of imperial candidates because, in his reasoning, the empire itself derived its origin and its final authority from the papacy. The emperor was crowned by the Pope. Therefore, the emperor existed, in a sense, at the Pope's sufferance. The referee, Innocent was saying, outranks the players, and the referee had decided to start choosing who was allowed on the field. He chose Otto, not out of love, out of calculation, which is the only currency Innocent really trafficked in. The other serious possibility, in the longer run, was the boy Frederick, heir to Sicily in the south. And Innocent's deepest fear, the fear that shaped nearly everything he did in these years, was of a single ruler holding both the empire in the north and Sicily in the south. The Papal States caught in the middle, squeezed between 2 jaws of the same mouth. Otto had no claim to Sicily. Otto was the safe choice. So Innocent threw the weight of the church behind Otto and let it be known, through his legates, that princes who rejected Otto risked excommunication for their trouble. And it worked. Innocent's man rose. The rival faltered and, in time, was murdered in a private quarrel that had nothing to do with the Pope at all, clearing the path completely. In October of 1209, Otto of Brunswick knelt in Rome, and Innocent set the imperial crown on his head with his own hands. Before the coronation, Otto swore the promises Innocent required: to leave the church's lands alone, to guarantee free church elections, to honor the Pope's authority. Picture the scene. the most powerful warlord in Europe, the man who commanded the armies of the German Empire, kneeling on stone while a slight lawyer from Rome, who had never led a charge in his life, lowered a crown onto him. The sun and the moon made flesh. The Pope had not merely blessed an emperor, he had made one, manufactured him from a disputed claim and a pile of parchment. Innocent had proven his sentence. The words from his consecration, higher than man, judge of all, were no longer just words. He had judged the highest man in the world and found him acceptable and crowned him for it. He had made an emperor. He assumed, as men who have just done something enormous always assume, that gratitude would follow, that the crown, once given, would stay bought. He was certain of it. Otto waited almost politely before he betrayed him. Almost. The ink was barely dry on his coronation oaths. The solemn promises to leave the Church's territories in peace, when the new emperor began to break them one by one, with the casual appetite of a man who has finally gotten what he wanted and sees no further reason to be pleasant about it. He seized the very lands he had sworn to leave alone. Ancona, Spoleto. The territories Innocent had spent his first year clawing back from German control. Otto simply took them again and handed them out to his own followers, as if the Pope's careful reconstruction of the Papal States had been a convenience laid on for the Emperor's benefit. And then he did the thing Innocent had built his entire imperial policy to prevent. He turned south, toward Sicily, toward the kingdom of the boy Frederick, the child Innocent was sworn to protect. In November of 1210, Otto pushed his armies down into the Sicilian mainland, reaching for exactly the union of empire and Sicily that had been the Pope's great nightmare from the beginning. The safe choice, the grateful puppet. He was invading the one place on earth Innocent had crowned him specifically to stay away from. Now, watch what Innocent does. He does not agonize. He does not send a wounded letter asking Otto how he could do this after all they had been through. He reaches for the instrument he trusts more than any army, the pen, and the terrible sentence it can write. He excommunicated Otto, the emperor he had made with his own hands. He now cast out, cut him off from the Church, declared his soul in peril, and more usefully, released Otto's own subjects from their obligation to obey him. This is the papal weapon in its purest form. Innocent could not beat Otto on a battlefield. He had no army that could. But he could stand up and announce, with the full authority of the Vicar of Christ, that this man's power was illegitimate, that God had withdrawn his endorsement, and watch the ground shift under the emperor's feet as men who had feared him began to wonder whether obeying him now damned them too. And then, having unmade one emperor, he simply reached for another. He turned to the boy, Frederick, the ward, the child king of Sicily, the very heir he had once schemed to keep off the imperial throne, for fear of that dangerous union of crowns. Necessity has a way of rearranging a man's fears. Now, Otto was the monster in the north, and the boy in the south was the solution. Innocent worked the German princes, worked the King of France, and engineered a new election. The princes renounced the excommunicated Otto and elected young Frederick in his place. Frederick, eager for the prize, swore all the same promises Otto had sworn, and one more besides, a solemn oath never to unite Sicily with the Empire. The exact wall against the exact nightmare, rebuilt in fresh words, as if fresh words had held the last time. Otto's power finally broke, as these things often did, far from Rome and by other men's hands. Shattered on a battlefield in France, at a place called Bouvines, where the King of France undid him. Otto lived a few more years as a nobody and died forgotten. An innocent had done it. He had made an emperor, unmade him, and made another. Twice now he had reached into the highest office in the world and rearranged it like furniture. But there's a quiet thing underneath the triumph, and Innocent, I suspect, did not let himself look at it too closely. He had not actually controlled Otto. He had only replaced him. The first man he raised to the summit of earthly power had slipped his grip entirely, had taken the crown and the lands and the gratitude, and done precisely as he pleased, and the only thing Innocent could do about it was tear the man down and start again with someone new. That is not control. That is a man frantically rebuilding a dam that keeps failing and calling each new dam a victory. He had reached for an emperor and gotten betrayal. He had reached again and gotten a boy he now held twice over, as guardian and as kingmaker both. And of all the doors this careful, brilliant man would open in his life, the one he opened around this child would prove the one he understood the least. He thought he had solved the problem of the empire. What he had actually done was take a small boy under his wing. We should meet that boy properly. Because Innocent was about to spend years being his protector, and had no way of knowing what exactly he was protecting. To understand the strangest thing this careful man ever did, we have to go back, past the emperors, past the crownings, to the very first year of his reign, and to a deathbed. The year is still 1198. Innocent has been pope for only a matter of months. And down in the south, in the kingdom of Sicily, a woman is dying. Her name is Constance. She is the last of the old Norman line that had ruled Sicily, and she had married into the German imperial house. Married the fearsome emperor Henry VI, the same Henry whose death threw the empire into the two-man scramble we've already watched. Henry is dead now, and Constance, in the months she has left, is a woman with exactly one thing left to protect in this world: a little boy, her son, 3 years old. His name is Frederick. Now, put yourself in Constance's position, because it is a genuinely terrible one. She is dying. Her son is 3. He is, on paper, already a king. She'd had him crowned King of Sicily that very spring. A tiny boy in a great cathedral in Palermo, an event that must have looked less like a coronation than a christening. And she knows, with the clear eyes of the dying, exactly what happens to a 3-year-old king with rich lands and no father. He gets eaten by ambitious nobles, by grasping relatives, by the German warlords already circling Sicily like weather. A 3-year-old king is not a ruler. He is a prize, and prizes get fought over until they break. So Constance does the only thing she can think of. She reaches, in her will, for the one man in Christendom whose authority might actually stand between her son and the wolves. She names the Pope. She makes Innocent III the boy's guardian and the regent of the whole kingdom of Sicily, and then she lets go of the world and dies in November of 1198, trusting the most powerful man alive to keep her child safe. And here is the thing, he did. That's what I want you to sit with, because it complicates the man in a way that matters. It would be easy to tell this story as though Innocent were only ever a cold engine of ambition, and the boy only ever a piece on his board. But the records we have suggest something warmer and more troubling than that. Through the long years of Frederick's childhood, 9 years of his minority, Innocent served as his guardian, and by one old account, watched over the boy with the greatest fidelity. He defended the child's crown. He fought diplomatically, and sometimes with actual troops, to keep Sicily out of the jaws of the very emperors he was managing up north. When Otto invaded the south, part of what Otto was reaching for was this boy's kingdom, this boy's throne. And Innocent's fury at that invasion was not only strategic, he was, in a real sense, protecting his ward. There's a strange tenderness in it. The most powerful man who ever lived. The lawyer who moved kings around like furniture, spending years as the effective father of a fatherless boy, signing the documents that kept the child alive, standing for once, not as anyone's judge, but as a small person's shield. He could not have known who the boy would become. No one could. To Innocent, Frederick was simply a duty accepted from a dying woman, a small life to be kept safe, and then, later, a useful solution to the problem of a treacherous emperor. What the child would grow into, and what it would cost, belonged to a future Innocent would not live to see. For now, there was only the boy and the guardian, and the promise made over a deathbed. He was a man who opened doors, and this one, the door around this particular child, he opened gently out of something close to kindness, with a dying mother's trust in his hands. For now the boy is safe, and the guardian is faithful, and Innocent turns north and west again, across the sea to an island kingdom and a king who had no intention of kneeling to anyone. It began as so many enormous things do, with a job opening. In July of 1205, the Archbishop of Canterbury died. Now, to us, Archbishop of Canterbury might sound like a ceremonial title. A man in a fine hat. In 1205, it was one of the most powerful positions in England. The head of the English Church, a great landowner, a political force in his own right, the spiritual conscience of the whole kingdom. When that chair came open, everyone who mattered wanted to decide who sat in it. And three parties reached for it at once. First, the monks of Canterbury Cathedral. By ancient right, they were the ones who technically elected the archbishop, and a faction of the younger monks, terrified the king would force his own man on them, did something furtive and clever. In the dead of night, before anyone could stop them, they secretly elected one of their own, their sub-prior, a man named Reginald, and bundled him off to Rome to get the Pope's blessing before the king even knew what had happened. Second, King John. When John found out the monks had elected someone behind his back, he was furious. This was his kingdom, his church, and he had a candidate of his own, John de Grey, the Bishop of Norwich, one of his closest and most trusted men, a brilliant administrator who had served him faithfully for years. John leaned on the monks hard and got them to hold a second election, this time for his man, de Grey. So now there were two archbishops elect, two winners, two delegations riding for Rome to make their case. And there, waiting for them, was the third party, the one who actually held the pen. Innocent listened to both sides, and then, with the cool precision of the lawyer he had never stopped being, he threw both elections out. Reginald's, because it had been done in secret and irregularly. De Grey's, because it had been held while the first election was still under appeal, which under canon law made it void. Both candidates gone. Perfectly legal. Perfectly devastating. And then Innocent did the audacious thing. Rather than send the mess back to England to be sorted out, he told the Canterbury monks, who happened to be there in Rome, to hold a new election right there in front of him and to elect the man he wanted. That man was Stephen Langton, and Langton was, on his merits, an excellent choice. An English-born scholar, one of the finest theological minds in Europe, a man who had taught for decades in Paris. He'd known Innocent there, years before, when they were both just clever young men, and neither wore a crown. Innocent made him a cardinal, and then, in June of 1207, consecrated him Archbishop of Canterbury with his own hands. There was only one problem, and it was the whole problem. Nobody had asked the king. John had wanted de Grey. What he got was a man he had never met, chosen without his consent, in a foreign city, by a pope flexing a muscle no English king thought the papacy possessed, the muscle to simply appoint the most powerful churchman in England over the king's own head. And worse, from John's view, Langton had spent his whole adult life in Paris and Rome. His loyalties, his formation, his instincts, all of them pointed away from London. To John, this wasn't a bishop. It was an occupation. So John refused, flatly. He would not allow Langton to set foot in England as archbishop. And to make his fury unmistakable, he turned on the Canterbury monks who had done the deed, drove them out of their own monastery, seized the property of Christ Church Canterbury, and scattered the monks into exile abroad. Langton, the new Archbishop of England, could not even enter the country. He sat in a monastery in France and waited. He would wait 6 years. Two proud men then, neither able to back down without looking weak in front of a watching Christendom. The king, defending the ancient right of English kings to control their own church. The Pope, defending the claim he had staked his whole reign on, that he and he alone held the fullness of power, and that a king who defied him on a bishop was a king defying God. John thought he was refusing a bishop. He had no idea what he was about to lose. When words failed, Innocent reached for the weapon that had no equal. And it is the same weapon you already watched fall in the dark at the very start of this story. On the 23rd of March, 1208, Pope Innocent III laid all of England and Wales under interdict. We began the night here, so you know the shape of it. But now you know the man behind it, and that changes what it means. This was not a blind stroke of divine wrath. It was a calculated act by a canon lawyer who had measured precisely where a king was soft. John had money. John had soldiers. John had his barons, more or less, and his castles, and his fleet. What John could not manufacture, what no king could manufacture, was the thing the interdict switched off, the consolation of heaven for every soul in his kingdom. Understand exactly what an interdict was, because its cruelty is in the details. It did not excommunicate John personally, not yet. It did something colder and wider. It suspended the public sacramental life of the church across the entire territory. The church doors closed. The public mass stopped. Priests, where they prayed at all, prayed alone behind locked doors, with the people shut outside. No couple could be married with the church's right. And the cruelest one, the one the chroniclers could not stop writing about. No one could be buried in consecrated ground with the prayers of the church. The chronicler, Roger of Wendover, records that the dead were buried in ditches like dogs, without priest, without bell, without blessing. Another writer, Ralph of Coggeshall, called the whole spiritual atmosphere of those years horrible and miserable. The sealed doors, the unburied dead, a kingdom holding its breath. Innocent left exactly 2 doors open in the wall, and the choice of which 2 tells you everything about how his mind worked. He permitted the baptism of infants, because an unbaptized baby who died went, in the theology of the age, to a soul's exile forever, and even Innocent would not weaponize a newborn's eternity. And he permitted confession and last rites for the dying, because to deny a dying person the chance to confess was to hand their soul to the fire. And that was a line even he would not cross. Everything else he took. everything a living person needed to feel that God was still with them, day to day, the bells, the mass, the weddings, the funerals, all of it withdrawn, held hostage, against the stubbornness of one man in a hall in Westminster. Think about the psychology of it, because this is the thing Innocent understood that his enemies did not. He was not attacking John. He was attacking every person John was supposed to protect and letting them attack John for him. Every mother who couldn't have her baby churched, every family who had to put a father in a ditch, every villager who woke to silence where the bell should be. Innocent was betting that all of that grief and fear would flow eventually uphill toward the throne. That a king could withstand an army more easily than he could withstand a whole nation quietly blaming him for the silence of God. It was a monstrous thing to do. It was also, as a piece of pure strategy, breathtaking. Here was a man with no army in England at all, reaching across the sea and squeezing an entire kingdom in his fist. Not the land, not the castles, but the souls, and simply holding and waiting to see who could bear it longer. The interdict would last more than 6 years, 6 years of ditches and closed doors. Because John did something Innocent almost certainly did not expect. He didn't crack. He got rich. 18 months into the interdict, when the silence hadn't moved his king, Innocent escalated. On the 8th of November, 1209, he excommunicated John personally. Now it was not just the kingdom cut off, it was the man. His own soul declared forfeit, his subjects formally released from their duty to obey him. The full spiritual artillery of Rome trained on one English king. And John's response was not to weep or to kneel, or to send frightened envoys to Rome begging forgiveness. His response was to look around at all the church property in England, the bishoprics, the abbeys, the vacant sees whose bishops had fled into exile, and to think, more or less, well, if the church won't serve my people, the church certainly won't be needing all this income. So he took it. He seized the estates and the revenues of the vacant sees, the property of abbeys, the wealth of a church that had, in a sense, gone on strike. He taxed the English clergy at a scale that left contemporaries gasping. By the time it was over, John had pulled something north of £100,000 out of the church, an almost unimaginable sum for the England of that day, some sizable fraction of the entire annual wealth of the English church, diverted, year after year, straight into the royal treasury. And I have to pause and admire the sheer nerve of it. In the dry way one admires a truly shameless move at a negotiating table. Here is a man who has been told, with all the authority of heaven, that his soul is damned and his kingdom is cut off from God, and the conclusion he draws from it, coolly, is that the interdict has just made him the richest king in Europe. Innocent had reached across the sea to squeeze John's soul, and John had responded by turning the squeeze into a fountain of gold. He was very possibly the only man in all of Christendom who found a way to make money off the loss of his own salvation. You have to imagine Innocent in Rome, receiving these reports, the interdict biting for years, and the excommunicated king merrily counting the church's own coin, and feeling, for the first time, the specific frustration of the man who has pulled the biggest lever he owns and watched his opponent simply lean into it. Because here is the uncomfortable truth of these years, the one the story usually skips. The interdict, on its own, did not work. The people of England did not rise up against John over the silence of the bells. By several accounts, they mostly grumbled and joked about their king, and got on with the difficult business of living in a country where you couldn't get married in a church. The great weapon, the one that could switch off a nation's god, Innocent had fired it, held it down for years, and the king it was aimed at had not fallen. He'd gotten fat. For a while, a genuine while, it looked as though the world had finally found the thing, a king stubborn enough and shameless enough to simply outweight the most powerful man alive. And then the ground shifted under John's feet. Not from Rome, from closer to home, from his own barons, sharpening their grievances, and from across the channel, where a rival king was watching all of this with a very interested eye. By 1212, John was a man with too many enemies and not enough friends, and Innocent, patient, watchful, loyally innocent, chose exactly that moment to raise the stakes from spiritual to existential. The excommunication and the interdict had been the spiritual pressure. Now Innocent added the earthly kind. By the end of 1212, he moved toward the ultimate sanction, declaring John formally deposed, no longer the rightful king at all, and releasing his subjects from every bond of loyalty. And then, in January of 1213, he did the thing that turned a religious quarrel into a matter of survival. He authorized John's greatest rival, King Philip of France, to carry out that sentence. In plain terms, the Pope gave the King of France his blessing to invade England, cross the Channel with an army, throw John off his throne, and take the crown, with the full moral authority of Rome stamped on the invasion. Now, historians argue about the exact legal shape of this, whether Innocent ever issued a complete, formal, technically perfect sentence of deposition, or whether he held that thunderbolt in reserve as a very real and very credible threat and simply let Philip treat it as a green light. For John, sitting in England watching Philip assemble a fleet on the far shore, the legal fine print did not matter even slightly. What mattered was that the most powerful man in the world had just declared open season on his kingdom, and the second most dangerous man in Europe was building the ships to collect. And so John, who had outstubborned the interdict for years, who had gotten rich off his own excommunication, who had refused and refused and refused, John looked at that fleet across the water and did the math of a hinted man. And he folded. Completely. Spectacularly. In a way that turned his surrender into the cleverest thing he ever did. On the 15th of May, 1213, at a place called Ewell, just outside Dover, John met the papal legate, a man named Pandulf. And John did not merely submit. He went further than anyone dreamed. He took the entire Kingdom of England and Ireland with it, and he handed it over to God, to Saint Peter, to the Roman Church, to the Pope. He surrendered his crown and then received it back, not as a free king, but as a vassal, a tenant, holding England and Ireland from the Pope the way a minor lord holds a manor from a great one, and paying for the privilege a tribute of 1,000 marks a year, 700 for England, 300 for Ireland, owed to Rome forever. Picture what has just happened. The king, who would not kneel to accept a single bishop, has just knelt to hand over 2 entire kingdoms. He placed his hands between the hands of the Pope's legate, the ancient gesture of a vassal swearing to his lord, and made himself and all his heirs the feudal servants of the Bishop of Rome. He was absolved. The excommunication lifted. Langton, at last, allowed into England. And in time the interdict itself was raised, and the bells of England, silent for more than 6 years, finally rang again. He pushed. It opened. Understand the size of what opened here, because it is bigger than one humbled king. A pope in Rome, with no army in England, had reached across the sea and, using nothing but the threat of heaven's silence and a rival's fleet, made the crown of England a possession of the Church. Not conquered it, that a warlord might have done. He had made a proud king give it to him and thank him for the loan of it back. The claim from the consecration sermon, the sun and the moon, the fullness of power, here it was, made flesh, in a meadow outside Dover. The moon had knelt to the sun, and John, kneeling there, thought he had lost everything. In fact, he had just picked up the one weapon that could save him. Because a man who is the Pope's own vassal has a very powerful friend. If anyone should attack John now, Philip of France, say, with his waiting fleet, or a pack of rebellious barons with a list of demands, they would no longer be attacking a mere king. They would be attacking the property of the Pope. Innocent, having won, promptly called off the French invasion he had authorized. One did not invade the fief of the Roman Church. John had converted total humiliation into a shield, and within 2 years, he would raise that shield against his own barons and hand Innocent the strangest victory of his life. A victory that would refuse, absolutely and forever, to stay one. Two years after John knelt at Ewell, the shield he had bought turned into the strangest weapon in Christendom, and it cut in a direction no one intended. Here is the situation by the summer of 1215. John is the Pope's vassal, absolved, back inside the church. But he is still John, still grasping, still defeated in France, still squeezing his barons for money to pay for wars he keeps losing. And his barons have finally had enough. In June of 1215, in a meadow by the Thames called Runnymede, they corner their king and force him to put his seal to a document, a list of promises, limits on what a king may do to his subjects without law. We call it Magna Carta, the Great Charter, and 8 centuries later, it sits near the foundation of nearly every idea we have about a government bound by rules rather than by whim. But at the time, it was simply a peace treaty, wrung out of a cornered king at sword point. And John, the moment he was clear of Runnymede, did what cornered men do. He reached for his powerful friend. He was the Pope's vassal now, and a vassal under attack may appeal to his lord. So John wrote to Rome, and he framed the whole thing with a lawyer's cunning that Innocent himself would have admired. This was not, he said, a squabble between an English king and his nobles. This was a rebellion, an armed assault on the property of the Roman Church, because England now belonged to the Church, and an attack on the king was an attack on the Pope's own fief. And Innocent agreed. Of course, he agreed. In a bull, dated the 24th of August, 1215, a document known by its opening words, Etsi Carissimus, Pope Innocent III annulled Magna Carta, not amended it, not suspended it, annulled it, root and branch, and did it with a contempt that still lands 800 years later. He called the charter shameful, demeaning, illegal, and unjust. He said it had been forced on the king by violence and fear. And then the phrase that is almost breathtaking in its finality, he declared the Great Charter null and void, of all validity, forever. Forever. Sit with that word again, the way we sat with it in his consecration sermon. He is not striking down a bad law for now. He is reaching across all of future time and declaring that this thing shall have no force, ever, world without end. And in that single stroke you can see the whole shape of his power at its absolute zenith. He is the overlord of England and Ireland. He is about to host the largest gathering of churchmen the world has ever seen. And with one sheet of parchment, he erases the most important legal document in English history and excommunicates every baron who dared to write it. Now here is where it turns, and where the man's whole story hides in a single human choice. Because Innocent's own Archbishop, Stephen Langton, the very man he had rammed down John's throat back in 1207, the man whose appointment had started this entire war, Langton would not do it. Ordered to publish the excommunication of the rebel barons from his own pulpit, Langton refused. He had come to sympathize with the barons, with their charter, with the idea that even a king should live under law. And so this scholar, this creature of Rome, this man who owed everything he was to Innocent's favor, looked at the Pope's command and quietly said, no. Think about the boardroom logic on both sides, because both are airtight, and that is what makes it tragic rather than simple. From Innocent's chair, it is obvious. John is his sworn vassal. The barons are rebels against a papal fief. The law is the law, and the charter was extracted by force, which voids it. He is, by the rules of the feudal world he lived in, completely and correctly right. And from Langton's chair, it is just as obvious. A king who can do anything he likes is a danger to every soul in the kingdom. A charter that binds him is a mercy, and no amount of canon law should make a churchman bless tyranny. Both men are right. And so Innocent did the only thing his logic allowed. He suspended his own archbishop, stripped Langton of his functions, and confirmed the suspension himself that November, even as Langton came to Rome in person to plead. The Pope had silenced the one man honest enough to defy him. And so, on paper, Innocent won. Totally. The charter was dead. The barons were cursed. The archbishop was gagged. The moon had not merely knelt to the sun, the moon had been switched off entirely. He pushed. It opened. It did not close. Because here is what the most powerful man who ever lived could not do. He could annul the word. He could not annul the idea. Within a year, both men were dead. John, in the October of 1216, innocent 3 months before him. And the Charter Innocent had declared, void of all validity forever. The Regency government of John's own child heir reissued it within weeks of the old king's death, and again 2 years later, and again, until it became the bedrock of English law, precisely and only because a pope's stroke of the pen could not unmake what a whole country had decided was real. He had proven he could open the door of England's sovereignty and walk right in. He had proven, in the same motion, that he could not close it behind him. That was the precedent that would not shut, that one man in Rome could reach into a kingdom and command its very soul, and that even when he did, the thing he commanded away did not stay away. But you cannot understand the full pattern from one door. Because while England was burning over a charter, Innocent's mind was on a fire he had lit much earlier, in the very first months of his reign, years before John ever defied him. A war he had called with a trumpet blast of holy purpose, and then watched march somewhere he never sent it. To find the second door, we have to go back, past England, past the interdict, all the way to the beginning, because this was the very first thing Innocent tried to do as Pope, and it went wrong so slowly and so completely that it took everything that went wrong with Innocent's holy war can be traced to a single business meeting, and to the fact that a crusade, it turns out, is a customer like any other, and customers who cannot pay their bills are at the mercy of the men they owe. In the spring of 1201, the leaders of the Crusade, a group of northern French and Flemish lords, sent their envoys to the one place that could float an army across the sea, Venice, the great maritime republic, a city built on water and shrewdness, whose wealth came not from land or God but from trade, from ships, from the patient turning of money into more money. And at the head of Venice sat one of the most remarkable figures in this entire story, the Doge, Enrico Dandolo, a man who was, by this point, somewhere around 90 years old and very nearly blind, ancient, patient, and sharp as a blade under all that age. The deal they struck was staggering in scale. Venice agreed to build, from scratch, a fleet large enough to carry an entire army. The contract specified thousands of knights, thousands of horses, tens of thousands of men, some 33,000 crusaders in all, and to provision that whole host for the better part of a year. In exchange, the crusade would pay a fixed and enormous sum, on the order of 85,000 marks of silver, a figure to make a kingdom blink. Venice would even throw in 50 of its own war galleys, crewed and armed, in return for half of everything the crusade conquered. And Venice held up its end. That is the part people forget when they cast the Venetians as the villains of this story. Dandolo committed the entire economy of his city to this contract. For a year, Venice more or less stopped being a trading power and became a shipyard, its every hand bent to building the greatest fleet the age had seen, all on the promise of a Crusader army that would arrive and embark and pay. Then the army arrived, and it was a third of the size promised. This is the hinge on which everything turns, and it was nobody's grand scheme. It was a miscalculation, plain and human. The lords who signed the contract had promised 33,000 men. But you cannot summon 33,000 men by signing a paper. Many crusaders, it turned out, had made their own arrangements, sailed from other ports, or simply never come at all. When the host finally gathered at Venice, perhaps a third of the projected number stood on the sand, which meant the crusade owed Venice a colossal sum, the price of a fleet built for 33,000, and had in hand only the purses of 11 or 12,000. They could not pay, not remotely. And here I have to stop and note something. In the dry way, this whole affair rewards. In a story stuffed with holy vows and divine missions and men who claim to speak for God, the one party keeping an honest ledger, the one party that did precisely what it promised and expected precisely the same in return, was the city of merchants everyone else looked down on for being worldly. Venice was not pious. Venice was punctual. And when the pious army could not pay the worldly city what the pious army had solemnly agreed to pay, it was the merchants who suddenly held the whip. Dandolo did not need an army. He simply declined to let the crusade leave. He kept the whole host penned on an island in the lagoon, fed at Venice's sufferance, going nowhere, until someone worked out how the debt would be settled. The old blind Doge had the most powerful army in Europe sitting on his beach, and he owned every one of them, because they owed him more than they had. He did not have to raise his voice. He only had to wait and name his price. And the price, when he named it, was a city. The price was a place called Zara, and the moment the crusade agreed to it, the holy war stopped being holy and started being merely a war that happened to carry crosses. Zara sat across the Adriatic on the Dalmatian coast, a prosperous port that had once belonged to Venice, thrown off Venetian rule, and put itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. Now, the King of Hungary was not a Muslim. He was a Catholic monarch in good standing, and, as it happened, a man who had himself taken the Crusaders' cross. Zara was a Christian city, under the protection of a Christian Crusader king. And Dandolo's proposal was blunt. On your way east, stop and take Zara back for me. Do that, and we'll set the debt aside and carry you on to the Holy Land. Think about what is being asked. An army raised to fight the enemies of Christ, financed by the tears and taxes of all Christendom, blessed by the Pope himself, is being asked to spend its first blood conquering a Catholic city for the commercial convenience of the men who own its debt. It is the crusade eating its own tail before it has even reached the sea's far end. And innocents saw it coming. This is what makes it land so hard. Word reached Rome of the plan, and Innocent moved to stop it exactly as you would expect the master of the written word to move. He wrote. He sent letters forbidding the attack on Zara in the plainest terms, and threatening excommunication, the full spiritual death sentence, on anyone who took part. His warning was carried to the army and, in one account, read aloud to the assembled host, "Do not do this, because it is a city of Christians, and you are pilgrims." They did it anyway. The most powerful man who ever lived, the man who could switch off England's God from 1,000 miles away, told his own crusade, the war he had personally called, funded, and staffed, not to attack this city. And they attacked it. In November of 1202, the Great Fleet fell on Zara, and after a short siege, the Catholic city was taken and sacked by the Army of the Cross over the explicit, written, thunderous prohibition of the Pope who had sent them. So Innocent did the only thing left in his hand. He excommunicated them. All of them, the whole expedition, Crusaders and Venetians together, cut off from the church for what they had done. And then, almost immediately, we watched the limits of even that. Because Innocent needed the crusade to continue, Jerusalem was still the goal. The whole enormous machine was still in motion, and so within a few months, he blinked. He lifted the excommunication from the French and Flemish crusaders, absolving them, accepting their argument that they had been trapped by the debt, while leaving the Venetians, whom he blamed for engineering the whole thing, under the ban. Do you see the shape of it now? The same shape as England, wearing different clothes. He pushed. He called this war into being with all his power. It opened, the machine roared to life, the fleet sailed, the men marched. And now, at the very first test, it would not answer his hand. He could curse it. He could not steer it. He could excommunicate an entire army and then, days later, quietly take it back because he needed that army more than he needed the principle. That is not the mark of a man in control of a holy war. That is the mark of a man being dragged behind one, holding the reins, and calling it driving. And Zara was only the warm-up, because waiting at Zara, through that winter, was a young man with a wounded claim and an impossible promise, and he was about to offer the debt-ridden, already excommunicated crusade, a target so enormous it would change the history of the world. His name was Alexios, and he was selling the one thing a broke and guilty army most wanted to buy, a way to make everything right all at once, for a price someone else would pay. Alexios was a Byzantine prince, the son of a deposed and blinded emperor of Constantinople, that fabulous Greek city on the Bosphorus that was, in 1203, still the richest and greatest Christian city in the entire world, capital of the eastern half of the old Roman Empire. His father had been overthrown by a usurping uncle, and young Alexios, wandering the courts of the West, looking for a sword to reclaim his birthright, found one sitting idle and indebted on the beach at Zara. His pitch to the crusade leaders was a thing of beautiful, ruinous simplicity. "Take me to Constantinople," he said. "Put me and my blind father back on the throne my uncle stole. And in exchange," and here he opened his hands wide, "I will give you everything." He promised a fortune, 200,000 silver marks, enough to wipe out the Venetian debt with room to spare. He promised soldiers, thousands of them, to swell the army for the fight against Egypt, He promised ships, provisions, money to keep knights in the Holy Land for years. And he promised one thing more, the thing calculated to land on Rome like sunlight. He promised to bring the entire Greek Orthodox Church, which had gone its own way from Rome for a century and a half, back under the authority of the Pope, to end the great schism of Christendom, to hand Innocent, as a gift, the reunification of the Church that popes had dreamed of for generations. Now, I want you to genuinely sit in the Crusade leader's place for a moment, because it is easy to condemn them from here, and harder to swear you'd have done differently. You are the commander of an army that is broke, excommunicated at least once already, penned by its creditors, its holy purpose slipping further away with every idle week. And a prince appears and says, "One detour. One more Christian city, but this time not a sack, a restoration, putting a rightful heir back on his throne. And in return, every problem you have dissolves. The debt paid. The army doubled. The Pope delighted, his great dream of church unity delivered. What would you have done? In the cold, with the men hungry and the creditors patient, and the road to Jerusalem looking more impossible by the day. It did not feel like abandoning the crusade. It felt like the only way to save it. Innocent, of course, saw this coming too, and forbade it too. In the summer of 1203 he wrote again, flatly, furiously prohibiting any attack on the Byzantine Empire, threatening excommunication once more on any who marched against Constantinople. He had learned nothing about his own powerlessness, or perhaps he had learnt it and simply had no other tool but the pen. And this time, the letter did not even arrive in time to be defied. The fleet had already sailed for Constantinople before his prohibition could reach it. His own legate with the army, faced with a crusade about to fall apart, decided the diversion was the lesser evil and let it proceed, the Pope's own man, overruling the Pope's own policy, on the ground, 1,000 miles from Rome. They reached Constantinople. They forced the usurper out. They put young Alexios on the throne beside his blind father, exactly as promised. And then the promise came due, and Alexios discovered he could not pay it. The fortune he had pledged did not exist in a form he could raise. He squeezed his own people for it and raised perhaps half, and in doing so earned the hatred of the Crusaders who felt cheated and the Byzantines who felt robbed. In January of 1204, the young man who had promised the world was overthrown in a palace coup and murdered, and a new hostile emperor took the throne, a man with no intention of paying the Westerners a single mark. So there they sat, an enormous Crusader army, camped outside the walls of the greatest Christian city on earth, owed a fortune by a dead prince, excommunicated, more or less, for the third time by a pope they had long since stopped obeying, broke, angry, and armed, and a city of unimaginable wealth glittering just beyond the walls, its new ruler telling them to go to hell. And the man whose war it was sat 1,000 miles away in Rome, having forbidden, in writing, every single step that had led them to those walls. What happened next, they did without him. On the 12th of April, 1204, the Army of the Cross broke into the greatest Christian city in the world, and for 3 days it forgot entirely what it was. Constantinople. You have to understand what that name meant to feel the size of what happened. For nearly 900 years it had been the beating heart of Christian civilization, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, one of the greatest and most populous cities on earth, when the great towns of the West were muddy villages, ringed by walls that had never fallen to an enemy in all that time. It held the accumulated treasure and holiness of the ancient world, relics of the apostles, gold beyond counting, the learning of 1,000 years. To a knight from the mud of northern France, it must have looked less like a city than like heaven's own storehouse, standing open. And the men who had been cheated of their pay, who had marched and starved and been excommunicated for a prince who was now dead, looked at all that wealth glittering behind walls held by people who would not pay them, and something broke. The walls were breached. The new emperor fled. And the Crusade, the holy pilgrimage blessed by the Pope to liberate Jerusalem, fell upon Constantinople and tore it apart. I am not going to walk you through the worst of those 3 days. The channel does not do that, and this story does not need it. The horror lands harder in what was left behind than in any lingering on the doing of it. So let me tell you instead what the morning after looked like. Let me tell you about the church. Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, the single most magnificent building in the Christian world, a dome so vast and so high that visitors for centuries had said it seemed to hang from heaven by a golden chain. This was the spiritual center of Eastern Christianity, the way St. Peter's is of the West. And when the soldiers of the cross were done with it, the great silver screen was hacked to pieces and shared out. The altar, the holy table itself, was broken up for the precious metal. They brought pack animals into the sanctuary to carry the plunder out, and the beasts slipped and fell on the marble, and no one cared. The most sacred space in half of Christendom turned into a stable and a scrapyard by men wearing the cross of Christ on their shoulders. The loot flowed west in a river that ran for years. Relics, icons, gold, gems, the sacred inheritance of 1,000 years, prized loose and carried home to the churches and treasuries of Europe, where a great deal of it still sits. And the most famous pieces of all, 4 great horses cast in bronze, ancient even then, that had stood in the heart of Constantinople, were pulled down and shipped to Venice, where they were mounted high on the front of St. Mark's Basilica, looking out over the water. They are still there. 8 centuries later, you can stand in Venice and look up at 4 bronze horses that are, quite simply, the most beautiful piece of stolen property in Europe, a war trophy taken from a Christian city by an army that had sworn to save one. And when the killing and the carrying were finished, the Crusaders did the thing that reveals what the whole enterprise had truly become. They did not go on to Jerusalem. They never went to Jerusalem at all. They divided up the corpse of the Eastern Empire among themselves. They took one of their own, Baldwin of Flanders, and in May of 1204, in the ruined splendor of that same Hagia Sophia, they crowned him emperor. A Latin emperor on the throne of the Greek Caesars. They had come to fight for the holy places, and had instead conquered the wrong empire, and now they simply sat down on its throne and called it theirs. 1,000 miles away, in Rome, the news of what his holy war had done was making its way toward the Pope who had started all of it. And his answer to it survives in his own furious hand. When the news reached Rome, Innocent III did something that, for a moment, redeems him. He was furious. Genuinely, righteously, magnificently furious. And then he did something else, something colder, that tells you why fury was never the same as control. His anger survives, in his own words, in a letter he wrote to his legate, the man who had been supposed to keep the Crusade on its holy path and had instead blessed its diversion. And the letter is a scream on parchment. He reminded the legate what he had been sent to do, to gain not earthly riches, but eternal ones. He wrote of the Crusaders that their swords, the swords they were meant to raise against the enemies of Christ, were now, in his phrase, dripping with Christian blood. He raged that they had spared nothing sacred, that they had even torn the silver plates from the altars and hacked them apart among themselves. And to his own legate, who had dared to absolve what happened, he was merciless. "It is impossible," he wrote, "not to be moved against you, for you neither should nor could give any such absolution." Read those words and you hear a man of real conscience, appalled to his core at what had been done in his name. He saw it clearly. He named it as the crime it was. He understood that the great schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, which he had dreamed of healing, had instead been carved so deep by this atrocity that the Greek Church would, in his own words, come to detest the Latins more than dogs. And then, and here is the turn, the quiet, human, devastating turn that this whole story keeps making. Having condemned it with everything in him, Innocent kept it. Because when the fury cooled, the lawyer looked at the situation with clear eyes and saw an opportunity glinting inside the wreckage. There was now a Latin emperor in Constantinople, a Roman-obedient church installed on the Bosphorus. The Eastern Church that had defied Rome for a century and a half was suddenly at sword point under a Western master, and Innocent, who had wept over the swords dripping with Christian blood, began to wonder whether God had perhaps used this terrible thing for a good end. Whether the sack was, in some dark, providential way, the reunification of Christendom he had always wanted, delivered by means he would never have chosen. And so he accepted it. He worked with the new Latin Empire. He treated the conquest not as a wound to be undone, but as a fact to be managed, a possession to be kept. He denounced the outcome, and he pocketed it. He could do both, because he was two men in one robe, the reformer who genuinely grieved, and the statesman who genuinely calculated, and the second man always got the last word. Now, before we leave this, I want to stop the story for a moment and simply take the measure of the man at this exact point in his life, because it is easy to lose it in the catalogue of things going wrong. Set aside, for a breath, whether he controlled any of it. Just count what this one human being was holding in his hands, all at the same time, around the year 1210. An entire kingdom in the far northwest, England, lay silent under his interdict, its churches shut on his word alone. He had made one emperor and unmade him, and set a boy of his own choosing on the imperial throne. On the Bosphorus, at the other end of the Christian world, a Latin emperor sat where the Greek Caesars had reigned for 9 centuries, and the ancient church there now answered, however grudgingly, to Rome. In Sicily, a young king was growing up as his ward, and in a dozen courts across Europe, from Portugal to the Baltic, kings and princes waited on his letters, adjusted their marriages and their wars to his judgment, feared his displeasure the way men fear weather. No fleet was his. No great army was his. And yet there was not a corner of the Western world where a man could stand and say the Pope's reach did not touch him. Not the crowns, not the armies. That, a whole hemisphere held in one careful mind at one time, is what the word means. I'll break the spell of the story for just a moment, because if you've come with me this far into it, I'd like to ask you something small. We recently passed 500 followers on this show. It isn't much, I know, in the great scheme of the internet. It's a rounding error. But it's real, and it's growth, and every one of you who's here matters more than the number suggests. If you're enjoying this, the kindest thing you could do costs nothing. Share a favorite episode with a friend who'd like it. Leave the show a rating if your app allows, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from, and maybe a favorite story from history you'd want told. Those comments do something invisible but powerful. They teach the algorithm to carry this quiet little show to other people who'd love it too. So thank you. Truly. Now, back to Rome, and a man who had turned a holy war against Muslims into the sack of a Christian city, and was about to turn one against Christians at home. Because the door of holy war, once opened, did not close. Innocent had meant to send Christian swords against the enemies of the faith. What he had actually done was teach Christendom that the machinery of holy war, the indulgence, the muster, the blessing, could be pointed anywhere. At any city. At anyone a pope declared an enemy. He had opened a door, meaning to free Jerusalem, and left standing, forever, the idea that the faithful could be marched against the faithful, and the very next time that door swung, it would open not on a distant city across the sea, but on the green hills of southern France. The third door is the strangest of the 4, because it did not open onto a kingdom, or an army, or a treasure. It opened onto a question, one of the oldest and most dangerous questions any institution of power ever asks. Who counts as one of us? And who gets to decide? In the sunlit country of southern France, Languedoc, the land of the troubadours, of walled hill towns and a soft Occitan tongue, one of the richest and most cultured corners of Europe, there had grown up, over several generations, a different way of being Christian. Its followers were called Cathars, and also Albigensians, after the town of Albi. And they believed something that struck at the very root of everything Innocent's church stood for. The Cathars looked at the world, at flesh, at matter, at wealth, at the physical stuff of existence, and they saw not the good creation of a loving God, but a trap a prison made by an evil power, in which fragments of light, human souls, were caught and suffering. And from that single idea, everything followed. If the material world was evil, then a church that owned vast lands, that collected taxes, that dressed its bishops in gold and wielded the power of kings, the church was not the body of Christ. It was the most successful institution of the evil god. The Cathars rejected the sacraments because sacraments work through matter, water, bread, wine. They rejected the priesthood and its claim to hold the keys of heaven. They had their own holy ones, men and women both, called the perfecti, the perfected, who owned nothing, ate no meat, took no lovers, wandered the roads in simple black, and by the sheer visible purity of their lives put the comfortable, wealthy Catholic clergy to shame. Now, sit with why this terrified Rome in a way that a distant Muslim army never could. A Muslim army was an enemy at the gate, frightening, but clearly other. The Cathars were something worse. They were an alternative, a rival church, growing quietly inside Christendom, in Christian lands, speaking a Christian language, and saying to ordinary people, you do not need Rome. You do not need its priests, its sacraments, its tithes, its pope. There is a purer way, and it is right here. To an institution whose entire power rested on being the single, indispensable road to heaven that was not a heresy. It was an existential competitor. And there were others like them, at the edges. The Waldensians, the poor of Lyon, who had started simply by wanting to preach the gospel and live in apostolic poverty, and had been told they could not, and had kept doing it anyway, and so found themselves, almost by accident, on the wrong side of a line. That is what this door was really about. Not a battle, a line. Rome was being forced, for the first time on this scale, to stand up and draw a hard boundary around the faith and say, this, inside the line, is the church, and everyone in here is one of ours, and that, outside the line, is not the church, and the people out there are something else, something that can be dealt with. The trouble was that the line ran straight through living communities. Down in Languedoc, Cathars and Catholics were not two armies facing off. They were neighbors, brothers and sisters, the same families. And the local lords, above all Raymond, the Count of Toulouse, the greatest nobleman of the South, would not persecute them. Raymond was no Cathar himself, but he was tolerant and pragmatic, and these were his people, his vassals, his tax base. When Rome's legate demanded he hunt them down, he dragged his feet, and so the legate excommunicated him, the count, for the crime of not making war on his own neighbors. The pressure was building towards something. And then, on a cold riverbank, one January morning, it found its spark. The man who lit it was a papal legate named Pierre de Castelnau, and he did it, in a sense, by dying. Castelnau was Innocent's hard man in the south, the Cistercian monk sent to force the issue of the Cathars, the one who had excommunicated Count Raymond for his tolerance. He was, by all accounts, uncompromising, abrasive, the kind of envoy who makes enemies as a matter of policy. And in early January of 1208, after one final, failed, furious meeting with Raymond that ended in open hostility, Castelnau rode for the Rhone to cross the river and leave. He never crossed. On the 14th of January, 1208, on the riverbank in the grey morning light, a rider came up behind the legate and ran him through, and Pierre de Castelnau died there on the mud by the water, the personal representative of the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, murdered on the road. Who ordered it is a genuine mystery, and honesty requires me to say so. The killer was said to be a squire in the Count of Toulouse service, perhaps hoping to win his lord's favor by ridding him of the man who had excommunicated him. Whether Raymond actually commanded the killing, or merely benefited from the blame for it, no one can prove to this day. But it did not matter what could be proven. What mattered was what Innocent did with it. And Innocent, who had spent years pushing against the immovable tolerance of the South, now had exactly the thing that immovable objects yield to: an outrage, a martyr, a legate of Rome, cut down for doing the Pope's work. He reached, once more, for the greatest weapon in his arsenal, the Crusade. But this time he turned it in a direction it had never been turned before. The Crusade was an instrument forged to send Christian armies against the enemies of Christ, against Islam, against the frontier, to win back Jerusalem. Innocent now aimed it inward. He proclaimed a holy war not against a foreign faith across the sea, but against baptized Christians living in the heart of Catholic Europe. A crusade against the south of France. And to make it move, he sweetened it with a bargain that tells you how coldly practical the machinery of holy war had become. To earn the Crusaders' indulgence, the full remission of sin, a cleansed soul, the same priceless spiritual reward promised to men who spent years and fortunes marching on Jerusalem, you did not have to cross the sea. You did not have to give years. You had to serve in the fields of France for 40 days. 40 days of campaigning, a comfortable ride from home, and your soul was scrubbed clean. It was, in the brutal economy of salvation, the cheapest deal the Church had ever offered. And the knights of northern France, who had cousins and grudges and hungry ambitions, and a standing interest in the rich lands of the South, heard the offer and came. By the summer of 1209, an army of perhaps 10,000 had gathered, pious men and greedy men, and men who were both, which is most men, under the spiritual command of another of Innocent's legates, the abbot Arnaud Amalric. They marched south, into the country of the troubadours, toward the walled towns where Cathar and Catholic had lived side by side for generations. And the first great town that stood in their path was a place called Béziers. What happened at Béziers on the 22nd of July, 1209, is remembered as one of the darkest days of the medieval church. And the thing that makes it unbearable is how ordinary the choice was that caused it. The Crusader army arrived before the walls of Béziers, a prosperous town on a river, and made the town an offer that was, by the logic of the campaign, almost reasonable. Béziers was mostly Catholic, but living among the Catholics, openly, as they always had, were a number of Cathars, and the town's own bishop had drawn up a list, a little over 200 names, of the heretics sheltering inside. The deal was simple. Hand over the people on the list, and the rest of you, the good Catholics, have nothing to fear. Give up your neighbors and live. And the people of Béziers said, no. Sit with that refusal a moment before the horror rushes in and buries it. The Catholics of Béziers were not asked to die. They were offered their lives, their homes, their safety, at the price of pointing to the houses of the families they had lived beside for a lifetime and watching them be dragged away. And they would not do it, whether from loyalty or decency or simple stubbornness. The Catholic majority of Béziers decided that these people, heretics or not, were theirs, their neighbors, their townsfolk, part of the same living community, and that the line Rome was trying to draw straight through their streets was a line they would not help draw. They chose each other over the safety the Church was offering them. It was, I think, one of the quiet, doomed acts of moral courage that history mostly forgets. And it got them all killed. The end, when it came fast and by accident. There was no grand assault. A group of townsmen made a rash sortie out of one of the gates. A bit of bravado, some skirmishing, and it went wrong. A crusader was killed, tempers flared, and before the gate could be shut, the mercenary foot soldiers of the Crusade, the unpaid ones who lived off plunder, surged in through the opening. And once they were inside the walls, no distinction was made. Not between heretic and Catholic, not between fighter and family. The chroniclers tell of townspeople crowding into the churches for sanctuary and finding none. When it was over, the town was put to the torch. We do not know how many died. But we do not have to guess at how the men who did it felt about it, because their commander wrote it down in his own hand to the Pope. Arnaud Amalric, the abbot legate, reported the victory to Innocent in a letter, and the words he chose are the reason we still speak of Béziers 8 centuries later. His army, he wrote, sparing neither rank nor sex nor age, had put to the sword nearly 20,000 people. Now, the number is almost certainly wrong. Historians are confident of it. 20,000 was very likely more than the whole town held, an inflation, a boast. But look closely at what kind of boast it is, because that is the horror that survives the correction. This is not an enemy exaggerating a crime to shame the Church. This is the Pope's own commander, writing to the Pope and choosing to celebrate that no distinction had been made, that the faithful and the heretic had been killed together, indiscriminately, and reporting it not as a tragedy to be confessed, but as a triumph to be proud of. The line Rome had wanted drawn between the faithful and the rest had been drawn, at last, not with ink, but with fire, and drawn so wide it swallowed everyone. And there is one more thing said to have been spoken at Béziers that day, the most famous sentence of the whole Albigensian Crusade. But that line, it turns out, has a stranger history than the massacre itself. There is a sentence that everyone who has ever heard of Béziers remembers, and almost no one knows the strange truth about where it comes from. The sentence is this: kill them all. God will know his own. The story goes that when the Crusaders broke into Béziers, one of the soldiers turned to the abbot Arnaud Amalric, the Pope's own legate, the man in spiritual command, and asked him, in the chaos, how they were supposed to tell the heretics from the good Catholics. And the abbot is said to have answered, without hesitation, "Kill them all. God will know his own. Sort the innocent from the guilty in heaven. Down here, just kill everyone." It is the perfect line. It is chilling. It is quotable. It captures something true about the whole horror in 9 cold words. And I have to tell you, in the spirit of honesty this channel tries to keep, it is almost certainly something the abbot never said. Here is what the careful historians will tell you. That famous sentence appears in no account written at the time. It is not in Amalric's own letter to the Pope, the letter where he boasted about the 20,000 dead, where you'd think a man proud of the slaughter would happily record his own grim wit. It is not in the detailed chronicle written by a monk who lived through the Crusade. It appears, for the first time, about a decade after Béziers, in a collection of moral tales and edifying anecdotes written by a German monk who had never been to southern France, who was gathering up striking stories to illustrate spiritual lessons. And even he, the one man who wrote it down, hedged it. He did not say the abbot said it. He said the abbot was reported to have said it. A rumor, at second hand, a decade late, in a book of moral fables. So it is legend, not fact. And I want to be clear about that, because it matters to get history right, even when the truth is less tidy than the myth. But now, sit with the strange thing, because this is where it becomes interesting. Why has that unprovable sentence outlived almost every documented fact about that day? We don't remember the names of the townsmen who made the fatal sortie. We argue about how many died. The actual, verifiable words of the actual commander are known mostly to specialists. But the line he probably never said, everyone knows that. It has become the true memory of Béziers, more real, in the world's mind, than anything that provably happened. And I think it endures because it tells a truth that the mere facts could not. Whether or not any single man barked those words in the heat of the assault, the sentence describes, exactly and unbearably, the logic that was actually applied that day. No attempt was made to sort the faithful from the heretic. The killing made no distinction. Everyone inside those walls was treated as expendable, their sorting left to God. The legend is false as history, and perfectly true as testimony. Someone, years later, looking back at what had been done, reached for a line that would make the moral horror of it unforgettable, and they found one so good that it buried the facts underneath it. That is what happens, sometimes, when an institution does something it cannot quite look at directly. The bureaucratic record, the abbot's proud letter, the tally of the dead, is too cold to hold the horror. So the human mind manufactures a sentence to carry the weight the documents cannot. The legend is the conscience of the event, speaking the thing the paperwork refused to say. And behind the legend, the real machinery of the thing ground on, quieter, less quotable, and far more permanent than any single day of killing. Here is the thing about the door of the boundary. The loud part, the siege, the fire, the massacre, was over in an afternoon. The part that would not close was silent, and it took a different shape entirely from what came before. After Béziers, the Crusade rolled on. Carcassonne fell, and a hard, capable northern lord named Simon de Montfort was made the military leader of the whole enterprise and set about the practical business of the campaign, which, over the following years, looked less and less like a war on heresy and more like a conquest. Southern lords lost their lands. Northern crusaders gained them. The rich, distinct, independent-minded south of France was slowly broken and folded, over 2 decades, into the kingdom of the French crown. And I could tell you that story, the sieges, the shifting alliances, Simon de Montfort's eventual death beneath the walls of Toulouse, struck down by a stone. But that is the loud part again, the part that ends. Lands change hands in every century. Conquests come and go. The door that would not close was not a matter of who owned the South. It was a matter of what the Church had learned to do. Because to fight the Cathars, Rome had been forced to invent something it had never really needed before. Think about it. For 1,000 years, the Church's enemies had mostly been external and visible: pagan armies, Muslim powers, rival kings. You could see them. They were on the other side of a border or a battlefield. But a heretic was different. A heretic looked exactly like a Christian, lived in the same town, spoke the same tongue, attended, perhaps, the same Mass. The threat was no longer at the frontier. It was interior, hidden. It lived in what a person secretly believed, in the privacy of a soul. And you cannot fight a hidden enemy with an army. An army is for things you can see. To fight an enemy that hides inside ordinary life, inside belief itself, you need a different instrument altogether. You need a way to look into people, to question them, to test them, to detect the wrong belief behind the ordinary face. You need to build the presumption that a person's inner life can be investigated, audited, proven or disproven, that faith is not a private matter between a soul and God, but something the institution has the right and the duty to inspect. That is what Innocent's holy war against the Cathars really built. Not just a pile of conquered lands. Those would be squabbled over and eventually forgotten. It built the idea, and then slowly the apparatus, of systematically hunting the wrong belief, of trained men riding into a town not to fight anyone, but to ask questions, to hold inquiries, to compile the names, the way the Bishop of Béziers had compiled his little list of 200, and to keep compiling them, town after town, year after year, believing all the while that they were doing God's work by auditing the contents of their neighbors' souls. Innocent did not live to see the finished machine. Let me be precise about that, because it matters. The formal institution we call the Inquisition, the standing tribunals, the Dominican inquisitors riding circuit through the South with the full authority to detect and try heresy, that was built by a later pope, Gregory IX, more than 15 years after Innocent was in his grave. Innocent did not create the Inquisition. What Innocent did was open the door to it. He established that a crusade could be turned inward against Christians. He normalized the idea that heresy was a thing to be hunted, not merely preached against. He drew the boundary, in blood, between the faithful and the rest, and once that boundary existed, the machinery to police it followed as surely as night follows dusk. He pushed. It opened. It did not close. He had meant, perhaps, only to defend the faith against a rival church in one corner of France. What he left standing, forever, was something larger and colder, the settled conviction that the church could name who stood inside the circle of the saved and who stood outside it, and that those outside could be sought out, one soul at a time, and dealt with. The armies went home. The suspicion never did. 3 doors now stood open behind him. England's crown, Christendom's holy war, the boundary of belief, each opened by a different key, a law, a debt, a definition, and not one of them able to be shut again. And with perhaps a year of life left in him, at the very summit of his power, Innocent turned to build the 4th. And this one he did not open by accident, or in fury, or under the pressure of events. This one he built on purpose, in daylight, with the whole of Christendom watching, and of the 4, it is the one we still live inside. In November of 1215, Pope Innocent III did something that no one in the Western world had the power to do, and summoned the entire church into a single room. They came to Rome, to the Lateran, the great papal basilica, and the sheer scale of the gathering is difficult to convey. Some 400 bishops, somewhere between 800 and 900 abbots and priors, patriarchs from the far corners of Christendom, from Constantinople and Jerusalem, and beyond the churchmen, the ambassadors of the secular world, envoys from the emperor, and from the kings of France, England, Aragon, Hungary, Cyprus, Jerusalem. Well over 1,000 of the most important men in Europe assembled at one man's command to hear what he had decided the church should now become. We call it the 4th Lateran Council, and historians who spend their lives measuring these things do not hedge about its importance. They call it the most important council of the entire Middle Ages. Its decisions felt in the ordinary lives of ordinary Christians for centuries afterward. Think about what that gathering represented for Innocent, standing at the head of it. He had made and unmade an emperor. He had brought a king of England to his knees and made a kingdom his fief. He had turned the machinery of holy war against the enemies of the faith at home and abroad. And now, at the height of everything, he had called the whole of Christendom to attend upon him, and it had come. Every crown in Europe sent a man to stand in that room and listen. If you wanted a single image of what the most powerful man who ever lived actually looked like, it is this: not a throne on a battlefield, but a slight, aging lawyer at the front of a vast hall, and more than 1,000 of the mightiest men alive, fallen silent, waiting to hear what the rules would be now. And here is the quiet genius of what he did with that moment, and the reason this council matters more than all his wars. He did not use it to conquer anything. He had done conquering. The council issued some 70 decrees, and taken together they did something far more lasting than any conquest. They reached down, past the kings, past the bishops, past the great and the powerful, all the way down into the daily inner life of every single ordinary Christian in Europe. The peasant in the field, the widow in the town, the soul you could not see. He had spent his whole reign learning that you could not truly control kings and armies and crusades, that they slipped your grip, opened doors you could not close. So at the end, he reached instead for the one territory no rebel baron or greedy Venetian or treacherous emperor could take from him. Not the outer world of politics, the inner world of conscience. And the quietest canon of that great council was the one that changed the most. Of all the things Innocent III built, this is the one you could almost reach out and touch, and it is the one that outlived him by 700 years. Picture an ordinary person, a woman in a village in France or England or the German lands in the years after 1215. She cannot read. She will never see Rome, never meet a bishop, never in her life lay eyes on the Pope. The great dramas we have followed, the emperors, the Crusades, the fall of Constantinople, reach her only as rumor, if at all. And yet, because of what Innocent decreed in that hall, something entirely new now enters her life, and it enters at the most intimate possible level. Once a year, at least, she must go to her own priest, not any priest, but her assigned parish priest, the specific man who knows her name and her neighbors, and she must kneel, and she must say aloud to him every sin she can remember committing, not her public crimes, her sin, the private one, the bitter thought about her sister, the thing she wanted that was not hers, the doubt she felt in the dark, all of it spoken once a year into the ear of a man who represents the institution. And if she refuses, if she will not come and confess, then she is cast out of the church, barred from communion, and denied, when she dies, burial in holy ground. That was Canon 21, and I want you to feel how radical it was, because familiarity has worn the strangeness of it. Confession had existed before, of course, but it had been irregular, uneven, a pious act some people undertook. Innocent's counsel made it universal, mandatory, annual, tied to a specific, named priest for every adult Christian in Europe. In one stroke, the Church installed itself inside the private conscience of every person in Christendom, made the inner life a thing that had to be reported regularly to an institutional representative on pain of exclusion from heaven itself. Think about what that actually is as an instrument of power. Innocent had spent his life discovering the limits of the outer kind. He could lay an interdict on England, and John got rich. He could forbid a crusade, and it sacked Constantinople anyway. The outer world fought back, slipped away, refused to stay closed. But this reached the one place none of that resistance lived. It did not require an army or a fleet or a treasury. It required only a priest in every parish, which the church already had, and a rule that every soul must open itself to him once a year. It was the most efficient exercise of power imaginable, total, intimate, self-enforcing, and running on machinery that was already in place. A single canon, and the interior life of a continent became something the church could see into. That same council fixed another piece of the inner architecture. Canon 1 declared, as binding dogma for the first time, the doctrine of transubstantiation, the teaching that when the priest speaks the words over the bread and the wine at the altar, they truly and actually become the body and blood of Christ. Not a symbol, not a reminder. The thing itself. And notice what that does. It makes the priest, that same local priest who now hears your yearly confession, the indispensable hinge of your salvation, twice over. He alone can work the daily miracle at the altar that feeds your soul. He alone can hear the confession that keeps you inside the church. Remove him, and there is no bread that is more than bread, and no forgiveness that counts. The whole vast edifice of the church now rested, in each person's life, on the one man in the parish who held those two keys. So consider what has just been built. Not a crown, not a fief. He has reached past every king and every army, and set a permanent watchman inside the private soul of every believer in Europe. And that watchman was still standing, still hearing confessions, still lifting the bread, 7 centuries after Innocent himself was dust in a cathedral floor. Emperors build things that fall. This did not fall. The whole apparatus of the modern Catholic Church that would endure into our own age, the confessional, the parish structure, the sacramental spine of it, this is the man, and this is very nearly the moment it was set. And that same great council, having reached into the conscience of every soul inside the circle of the faith, turned in its final work to the people it had decided stood outside it. To define who is inside a circle is, in the same motion, to define who is outside it. And the Fourth Lateran Council, having drawn the inside as tightly as a priest in every conscience, now drew the outside too, and put a mark on it. Among the council's decrees was one, Canon 68, that dealt with the Jews and Muslims living within Christian lands. And its logic was, in a sense, the same logic that ran through everything Innocent did, the drive to make the boundaries of belief legible, visible, enforceable. The canon declared that Jews and Muslims must be distinguishable from Christians by their dress. They were, it said, to wear clothing that set them apart, so that they could not be mistaken for Christians. The stated reason was to prevent Christians from unknowingly mixing with them. Companion canons hemmed them in further, restricting the interest they could charge on loans, barring them from holding public office, curtailing their movement at certain holy times. I am going to handle this plainly, and without reaching, because the plain fact carries enough weight on its own. What the council mandated was distinctive dress, a visible mark of difference, decided in principle in Rome, and left to individual kingdoms to make specific. England was the first to enforce it, ordering within 2 years that Jews wear a badge upon their clothing. And this canon is recognized by historians as the origin point of a practice, the marking of a religious minority by compulsory dress that would have a long, and in later centuries, a very dark history in Europe. I am not going to draw a straight line from a medieval churchman to horrors that came 700 years later, because that line would be false, and this channel does not trade in false lines. Innocent could not see the future, and the distance between his world and later atrocities is filled with 1,000 choices he had no part in. But I will let the fact sit exactly where it belongs, in his own story, as one more instance of the single thing this whole council was doing: drawing boundaries, deciding who was inside the faith and who was outside it, and then making that decision permanent and visible and enforced. The same pen that put a confessor inside every Christian conscience put a mark on the coat of every outsider. Inclusion and exclusion, written by the same hand, in the same weeks, as two halves of one act, the act of an institution deciding, once and for all, exactly where its walls stood, and who was to be kept in, and who was to be kept out. Before we follow this remarkable man to the end of his road, let me pause once more and ask something of you, and this one is genuinely for you as much as for me. If, somewhere in these long histories of power and its limits, there's an institution, or an empire, or a figure you find yourself wanting to understand more deeply, the way we've spent tonight trying to understand this one, I would truly love to hear it. Drop it in a comment. Tell me the thing you'd want a quiet night like this spent on. Or just tell me a favorite figure from history, someone whose story has stayed with you. I read them. I keep a list, and more of these episodes than you'd guess have begun as a single sentence somebody left in the dark. So tell me where to look next. Now, Innocent had reached kings and souls and the very edges of belief. He had opened 4 great doors and shut not one of them. He had, by any measure the world could apply, more power in his hands than any human being had ever gathered. He had, as it happened, 1 year left to live. And he would spend it, fittingly, the only way he knew how, reaching for one more door. Somewhere in these last years of his life, if he ever stopped to look, Innocent III might have noticed a strange and quiet thing about everything he had built. It no longer needed him. Consider what was running all at once by 1215, and ask yourself how much of it still turned by his hand and how much simply turned on its own. England was his fief, but it was his lawyers and legates and the machinery of feudal obligation that kept it so, not his daily attention. The Latin Empire sat on the Bosphorus, a going concern, dividing its spoils and appointing its bishops, needing nothing from Rome but the occasional blessing. The war in the south of France had a life entirely its own now. Simon de Montfort seizing lands, the Crusaders coming and going on their 40-day cycles, the whole grim engine of conquest and suspicion grinding forward, whether Innocent pushed it or not. And the confessional he had just installed in every parish in Europe would function identically whether the Pope who ordered it was alive or dead, brilliant or foolish, watching closely or not watching at all. This is the thing about building institutions instead of just winning victories, and it cuts both ways, like everything about this man. A victory needs you. You win a battle, and the moment you turn your back, the enemy regroups. You must keep winning it forever, in person. But an institution, a law, a tax, a rule, a habit installed in millions of lives, an institution runs by itself. That is its glory and its horror both. Innocent had spent his life learning that he could not personally control anything for long. Not emperors, not crusades, not kings. So he had done the only thing a clever man can do with that knowledge. He had stopped trying to hold things in his hand and started building things that would hold themselves. Machines of authority that needed no operator. And he had built them so well that they no longer required their maker at all. Now, here is the question I'd like to leave with you, turning slowly as we come toward the end of his road. And it is not a question about a medieval pope. It is a question about every large and powerful thing that human beings build. Because you have watched this happen. You have worked inside a company, or lived under a government, or belonged to an institution, and you have seen the thing outgrow the intentions of whoever founded it. You have watched a rule meant to solve one small problem calcify into a permanent feature that no one can quite remember the reason for, and no one has the power to remove. You have seen the founder's vision curdle into something the founder would not recognize, running on its own momentum, indifferent now to what anyone wants. So the question is this: when a person builds something larger than themselves, a law, an empire, an institution, a machine of power meant to outlast them, who, exactly, is in control of it? The builder, who set it in motion and then died. The people who run it now, who mostly just tend the gears they inherited. Or no one at all. Is a great institution simply a thing that, once started, runs and runs on its own logic, using up the human beings who imagine they command it, until it finally, for reasons of its own, stops? Innocent would not answer that question. He was busy. He did not die at the summit, in Rome, presiding over his great machine. He died on the road, in a dusty town in the hills, still pushing, still trying, with his last strength, to open one more door. In the summer of 1216, the most powerful man who ever lived was doing what he had always done. He was managing other men's quarrels, patiently, for a larger purpose, on the road. He had gone to Perugia, that quiet town in the Italian hills we passed near the very beginning of his story, when he was young and gathering the cities of central Italy into his hand. Now he was old, or old for his time, somewhere around 55, and he had come to Perugia to broker a peace. Two great maritime cities, Genoa and Pisa, were at each other's throats, and Innocent needed them to stop because he needed their ships. He had called one more crusade, at his great council, the fifth of the age, and a crusade needed fleets, and the fleets of Genoa and Pisa could not carry the cross to the Holy Land if they were busy sinking each other in the Mediterranean. So, there he was, the man who had humbled England and crowned emperors, spending the last strength of his life trying to get two cities of merchants to shake hands, so that his final door, the recovery of Jerusalem, the goal he had reached for first, 18 years before, and never touched, might finally open. It is a fittingly human way to find him at the end, not enthroned in glory, working, still reaching, still, after everything, convinced that with the right letter, the right pressure, the right arrangement of other men's interests, he could steer the world where he wanted it to go. And then, in Perugia, a fever took him, sudden and severe. We don't know precisely what it was. Later writers guess at malaria, the curse of the Italian summer, though no one at the time recorded a diagnosis, and we should not pretend to more certainty than they had. What we know is that it came fast, and that it did not spare him for being who he was. The Vicar of Christ, set between God and man, lower than God but higher than man, the one who judged all and was judged by none, burned with the same ordinary fever that took peasants and merchants and kings, and on the 16th of July, 1216, in a town he had brought to heel in the first year of his reign, Pope Innocent III died. The most powerful man who ever lived. Gone, mid-errand, still holding a plan half-finished. And what happened in that cathedral over the following night is the one part of his whole story that reads less like history than like a parable, as though the universe itself wished to make a point. They laid him in state in the cathedral of Perugia, as was fitting for a pope, robed in the magnificent vestments of his office, draped in the precious things that marked him out as the greatest churchman in the world. And they left him there overnight, in the great dim church, with the candles burning down. And in the night, thieves came. I want to tell this carefully, the way the one witness told it, because the power of it is not in anything gruesome. It is in a single, quiet, devastating irony, and the horror is entirely in the meaning, not the sight. We know what happened because of a man named Jacques de Vitry, a churchman who arrived in Perugia the very next morning on business of his own, hoping to see the Pope confirm his appointment to a bishopric. He walked into the cathedral, and he found that in the dark, unguarded hours, thieves had crept in and stripped the body. They had taken the rich vestments. They had taken the jewels, the precious ornaments, everything of value that had draped the corpse of the most powerful man in Christendom. And they had left him there, abandoned, robbed of every emblem of his greatness, in the empty dark, with no one keeping watch. Jacques de Vitry looked at what was left, and he did not see a crime. He saw a sermon. Here was a man who, the day before, could give or withhold heaven from the soul of every person in Europe, who had made kings into vassals and boys into emperors, who had reached into 1,000 consciences and drawn the boundaries of the faith itself, and he could not keep his own funeral robes on his own body for a single night. The man who had commanded the wealth and reverence of half the world lay plundered by common thieves in an empty room, as forsaken and unattended as the poorest beggar who ever died in a ditch. And de Vitry, standing there, reached for the oldest lesson there is, and is recorded to have reflected on it in words close to these: how brief and how empty is the deceptive glory of this world, Remember the young cardinal, decades before, who wrote a whole book on the misery of the human condition, on how small and temporary and wretched a human life really is. Dust briefly animated, glory briefly borrowed. He had known this. He had written it down before he had any power at all. And here, at the end, the world simply took him at his word. The man who wrote that all earthly glory ends in nothing was left, at the last, as a demonstration of his own thesis. He had opened 4 great doors that would not close, and the only door that ever did close, the only thing in all the world his power finally, absolutely could not hold open, was the door of his own life. That it closed, in a night, in the dark, while thieves took his coat. But the doors he had opened onto the world did not close with him. They did not so much as tremble. And one of them, the quietest one, the one he had opened out of kindness a lifetime before, was now a grown man and loose in the world. Do you remember the boy? The 3-year-old king, the orphan, the child whose dying mother placed him in the Pope's hands. While Innocent lay stripped in Perugia, that boy was 30 years into a life that would earn him a name. History has rarely given anyone stupor mundi, the wonder of the world. Frederick II grew up to be the most dazzling and dangerous ruler of his age. Brilliant, skeptical, restless, fluent in 6 tongues, keeping a court unlike anything Christendom had seen. And he became something else, too. He became the single greatest enemy the papacy would face for 2 generations. The empire and Sicily, north and south, the exact union that Innocent had spent his whole reign and half his cunning trying to keep apart, came together at last in the person of this one man, the very child Innocent had raised and protected and finally set upon the imperial throne. The nightmare Innocent built his entire imperial policy to prevent walked the earth wearing the face of the boy he had saved. Now, I have to be careful here and honest, because the easy version of this story is a lie, and this channel does not tell the easy lie. It would be neat and satisfying and completely false to say that Innocent unleashed his own destroyer, or that some prophecy came due. He did not. Every bit of the long, bitter war between Frederick and the Church happened after Innocent was dead, years after, decades after, under other popes entirely, men who inherited the problem and mishandled it in their own ways. Innocent never saw a moment of it. He made no prediction. To him, Frederick was only ever a duty accepted from a dying woman, and then a useful solution to the problem of a treacherous emperor. The guardian did his guardian's work in good faith and closed his eyes, and only the cruelty of time arranged the rest. But that is exactly what makes it the truest note in the whole story. This is not a tale of a curse, or a prophecy, or a man punished for his sins by a vengeful fate. It is something quieter and far more unsettling. It is simply what happens. You cannot choose who inherits the world you build. You set a thing in motion, a boy on a throne, a rule in a parish, a war in the south, a crown made a fief, and then your part ends, and other hands take it up, and it goes where it goes, and becomes what it becomes, and there is not one thing you can do about it, because you are gone. The most powerful man who ever lived raised a child with the greatest fidelity, and that child grew up to try to tear down everything he had built. Not as punishment, just as consequence, just as the way of things. Every door he opened outlived his command of it, including the one with a face. So let us stand at the last in the emptied cathedral and simply look at what remains. The man is gone, stripped, in the dark, as low as any man who ever lived. That is the emotional truth of it, and it is a small and human and almost unbearable thing. A great soul, robbed of his coat, alone. But look up from the body, and look out at the world he leaves behind, and you see the other truth, the larger one, and it does not care about the body at all. Because the doors are all still open, every one of them. The crown of England he made a fief. The charter he annulled forever came back within weeks of his death and grew, over centuries, into the foundation of how free peoples bind their kings. The thing he tried to close is now carved into the law of nations. The holy war he turned against Christians taught Christendom to make war on itself, and the machinery of suspicion he set in motion hardened, under the popes who followed, into the long apparatus of the Inquisition. The Latin Empire limped on in the East, and the great wound between the churches never healed. And the priest he placed inside every conscience, the confessional in every parish, the whole sacramental spine of the church, that one is perhaps the most open door of all, because it ran and was still running 7 centuries later in 10,000 parishes, in the ordinary Tuesday morning lives of people who had never heard his name and never would. That is the thing to see at the end. He thought his power was the power to command, to open, to seize, to make and unmake. And it was. But every single thing he opened simply went on without him, exactly as it pleased, the moment he let go. The power was never really his. It was the institutions. He was the hand that pushed the doors, but the doors belonged to the machine, and the machine did not love him or need him, or notice when he died in a hill town and was robbed of his robes in the dark. It just kept running. It is running still. And so the sentence he preached over himself at the very beginning comes back at the very end and turns over in the turning. Lower than God, higher than man, he had said, standing in his glory, the one who judges all and is judged by none. Look at him now. Lower than God, yes, but no longer higher than any man at all. As low, in the end, as the lowest of them. Judged, at the last, by the same fever, and the same thieves, and the same darkness that judge us all. Long after, 7 centuries after, another pope would have his bones dug up and carried to Rome and laid, with honor, in one of the great basilicas, as if the church was still trying to find a shelf grand enough to finally let him rest. Perhaps he rests there. Perhaps a man who spent his life opening things that would not close does not, in the end, rest anywhere at all. He could open any door in the world. He could close only one, and it was his own. We began by saying that power is not what we usually think it is, not the army, not the throne, not the sword. And now, having sat with the most powerful man who ever lived, perhaps we can say the quieter thing that his whole life was trying to teach, without ever quite teaching it to him. The ones who look omnipotent, the ones who seem to bend the world to their will, are very often just the ones who happened to start something that has not stopped yet. Beginning is the cheap part. Anyone with enough force, or enough cunning, or enough certainty can open a door. It is the closing that no power on earth can buy. The letter once sent cannot be unsent. The war, once called, marches where it will. The institution, once built, outlives and ignores its maker. And the boy, once raised, grows up into whoever he was going to grow up into. And there is nothing the guardian can do but love him and let go. So here is the thought to carry down into sleep, turning slowly, unanswered, because it was never really about a pope. When you set something in motion in your own life, a habit, a decision, a word said in anger, a thing built to outlast you, are you the one in control of where it goes? Or are you only the hand that pushed the door, and everything after, the long swing of it into a future you will never see, belongs to the door and not to you? He is gone. The doors are still open, and somewhere, quietly, they are opening still. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, midnight magnates. And wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues.